grandpa rolls with freedom fighters. How cool is that? It was just really, really phenomenal to grow up with that sense of his work in the world. And from the first I can remember, I was asking him to take me with him, and when am I going to be able to go travel to Africa with you? I got my wish in 1994 when I was able to join, along with my grandmother, a study tour to the new South Africa. And it was called a study tour, but it felt more like a star-studded post-revolution victory lap, because it was in the wake of the first free elections. The honeymoon, period and sense was absolutely palpable, and we met with so many people, both huge names in the struggle, and I'd had the opportunity to study a bit about South Africa, so I understood that when I was sitting next to Walter Sisulu and he put 2 teaspoons of sugar into his tea and whispered conspiratorially to me not to tell his wife about his sugar intake, I was like, Ma, Sisulu, if I ever get to meet Albertina Sisulu, I will not be talking about your sugar intake. No problem. We went to Cape Town and we met with the new Speaker of the National Assembly, Frenny Jinwala, who was in a beautiful green sari and said casually that one of her first orders of business was to say the Speaker would no longer be wearing black robes and a wig. And it was just surreal, to understand that this change had just happened. I was totally inspired. And if my grandfather were here now, he would say, Emily, were you totally inspired? I'm from California, so that's how I speak. And I was totally and completely inspired. I would return to South Africa to get a master's in the fascinating, not totally marketable degree of South African politics at the University of Cape Town. But it gave me even more of a sense of what my grandfather had been doing. Like Uncle Steve, even with watching the videos or the films and having a bit of a sense of what the American Committee on Africa was doing, I really didn't get the full weight of what he'd done or his significance until I started studying myself about African liberation and the movements. I came of age I graduated, in high school in 1990, and so Namibia had just had their first free elections. Mandela was released, and so I only knew a real reality where my grandfather was being invited to tea at the state houses of freed African nations, and so I think, again, it was really phenomenal to find out how much he was squarely on the right side of history, and how much I had to ask him about, how did it feel to have an FBI file about you, and, to be accused of consorting with communists, both during the Red Scare and the Cold War, and he really did sort of dismiss these questions. I think he just felt like that comes with the territory, and he had the conviction of knowing that he was working towards right, that the arc of history would be long, but bend towards justice, and not be overly concerned about what enemies he was making or what trouble he was getting into in the meantime. He also had the support of his family. I remember him telling me that when he did go to prison, his parents got death threats, and that they were, still supportive of him and really saw what he was doing as worthwhile. I think meant a lot. The support of family is absolutely critical. And the fact that my grandmother, who was an incredibly credentialed and accomplished woman in her own right, was being the primary caregiver for 4 wonderful, well-adjusted people speaks to, my grandfather's ability to have a really phenomenal professional life, to really make a difference in terms of his work, and have a wonderful family at home that he took so much pride and enjoyment in having. So thank you, Grandma, for that. I think that this has already been spoken about in terms of my grandfather's ability to bring together diverse groups of people, and I am always or I've always admired the fact that he would be, you know, friends with, working with anybody who felt similarly about social justice and about fighting racism. Race, ethnicity, sexual orientation even didn't matter. If you were working towards social justice, you were a comrade of George Hauser's. And I think that's absolutely remarkable. And I think that he was, you know, someone who clearly brought people together in order to make the world a better place. I now have spent over a decade working in Asia and Africa for gender equality in education, and I sometimes feel very much like I'm walking in my grandfather's footsteps, literally, when I deplane and cross the tarmac at Kenneth Kaunda International Airport in Lusaka. It's wonderful to think my grandfather walked across this tarmac as well. And I like to think, or I hope that, along with walking in his footsteps, I and all of us are able to continue along that path and move even further together on this trajectory that he and so many people have been working towards, in a path that they've paved for this long. So with my grandfather's passing, I've been inspired to think more about how I can be a peacemaker and peace builder for myself, for my community, how I can think more about the pressing issues of our day that continue, like gender-based violence, like the subjugation of minority ethnic groups and lingual groups, like police brutality, Black Lives Matter. It's just been a really neat way to kind of re-up my commitment to move forward and continue to try to make the world a better place. So, Aluta continua.
Some of our next speakers will be delivering messages from the African continent. There are some messages in your program already from a service or a program that took place almost a quarter century ago in 1981 when George retired from ACOA. From distinguished African leaders, we will be hearing from some living African dignitaries through the voices of some of the dignitaries on our stage now. Prexley Nesbitt is our next speaker. He is a professor at not this Columbia, but Columbia College in Chicago, Illinois. He and Marty Lays, who coordinated this program, founded in 1966 one of the first university efforts to resist the apartheid regime at Antioch College, the Antioch Committee for Free South Africa. He was the first coordinator of the committee to oppose bank loans to South Africa, known as COPLSA, COPLSA, and has continued working for decades now on liberation and solidarity with the African peoples. His work in the context of Mozambique in particular lends his voice to sharing words from Graça Machel.
Amanda. Great. All right, I wanted to make sure you all knew the right words to get these things going. I'm very pleased, very honored to be here and to be here also representing, as it were, Graça Machel. I'm pleased and honored not only because of having the opportunity to speak to Mrs. Hauser and to the whole Hauser family, but to also appear before so many of you who I have participated in all kind of work with through the years. And it's that gives me the greatest pleasure. I want to say to you that Graça's statement is still coming. The Mozambicans are a bit famous for things still coming. And Mrs. Hauser, I commit to you that when it gets there, and to all of you Hausers, as soon as the statement gets here, I will get it to you. But the Mozambicans are famous. Things still coming. The other commitment I can give you is that when it does come, it will be eloquent, and it will be beautiful, and it will be comprehensive, because I know them very, very well. I want to say a couple things on my own behalf. As a former staff member of the American Committee on Africa, on 2, maybe 3 occasions, Jen, I can't even remember. But I have to share with you that I have a particular immediate debt to George that I don't think any of the rest of you have. And that was that in 1978, George sent me on a mission to Botswana to take some money to Black Consciousness Movement students in Gaborone, Botswana. And so people heard that I was coming. And so I was sent to an old dormitory, and when I walked in the room, there were about 600 BCM students crowded into this dormitory. And I was introduced as this representative from the American Committee on Africa. Well, these were very vigilant, very serious revolutionary brothers, and they heard my American accent, and it wasn't fun from then on until I said, George Hauser sent me to give you all solidarity. And at that point, a man stood up and came forward. I later learned it was Wally Serote, one of South Africa's most eminent poets. And he said in front of the whole group, "Did you say George sent you?" I said, "Yeah, George Hauser, George Hauser." "Amandra," he said to me. And then I was home free at that time. So George, wherever you are, I thank you, brother. I want to say, too, that as an African-American man from Chicago, I have to say a particular note of thanks to George for working both sides of the pond. He never just worked on Africa issues. He always saw a relationship between working on Africa and working on injustice in this country. And the older I got, the more I have learned from all these people like George and Bill Sutherland and Dillinger and Bayard Rustin and Meredith Dallas and Don Benedict, that group who were all imprisoned in Danbury. What integrity, what an example they have provided to the whole world about living what you believe. George was a remarkable person. I'm not sure he was much of a shortstop from what I've heard. The stories each of these people have told me about these baseball games in Danbury, each one of them seemed to be the superstar of the team. So I wish I could have played with it, that's all. But I did have the great honor to be deeply, deeply shaped by them as I was, as I am, by my own family. And how happy I am to see my cousin Kay and Willis Logan sitting out there. Because like George's family, my family says you do everything together. And so here we are as a family today, all of us celebrating the legacy of one of our best. Thank you very much.
Aaliyah Becky Vaughn also worked at the American Committee on Africa and was, before that, an anti-apartheid activist at Cornell University, and in 1990 started as coordinator of ACOA's Religious Action Network. In 1992, Aaliyah was seconded by ACOA to the SACC, the South African Council of Churches, where she worked until 1994. Where she had joined the International Election Commission that oversaw the first democratic election in South Africa. Leah will be reading a message from Max and Eleanor Sisulu.
Good morning. It's still morning. In memory of George Hauser. Preparing this message for the memorial of George Hauser has been a long and winding trip down memory lane, marked by reminiscences of the people who gave so much of themselves in pursuit of the struggle for freedom in Southern Africa, especially our beloved father, Walter Sisulu. We recalled our father Walter's delight when he received the request from George Hauser and Herbert Shaw to work on a set of archival interviews that resulted in the memoir, I Will Go Singing. It was George who chose this title because he was so moved by Walter's statement that the Rivonia trialists had decided that if they were sentenced to death, they would go singing to the gallows. In the months of September and October 1985 and January and February 1997, George and Herb spent many hours with Tata Walter, and the two of them became known in our family as Tata's American friends. At the time, my wife Eleanor was working on the biography of my parents, Walter and Albertina Sisulu, so she facilitated the interviews with Tata, with George and Herb. Walter Sisulu's association with George Hauser dated back to the 1950s, when Walter, in his capacity as Secretary General of the African National Congress, wrote to the Congress of Racial Equality in New York to request assistance for the Defiance Campaign. That started a long correspondence that influenced the development of an organized anti-apartheid lobby in the U.S. Their interaction developed into a strong friendship that endured through Walter's decades of imprisonment. The time they spent together in 1995 and 1997 was therefore very special for both men. Walter Sisulu had the highest regard for George Hauser, whom he regarded as the pioneer of the U.S. anti-apartheid lobby. He admired George's integrity and passionate commitment to social justice. He was deeply appreciative of the role that George played in our liberation struggle. The two of them shared a love of history of the region and had in common an extensive network of contacts, a veritable who's who of liberation struggle history. With George Hauser's passing, we mourn the last of an extraordinary generation of freedom fighters. We will forever hold him very dear in our memory. May his legacy live on. And the family, Walter and Eleanor and the entire Hauser family, the entire Sisulu family, also wants to extend their condolences to the Hauser family and all of the Hauser's friends and all of those friends that George made during his lifetime of struggle and solidarity. So I want to thank you for listening to the words of Max and Eleanor Sisulu regarding their love for George Hauser.
Gail Hovey also worked at ACOA, and her anti-apartheid work goes back similarly to the 1960s, like some of the others up in the days. In the 1980s, she served as ACOA's research director, and on its board, she will be reading a message from Dumisani Kumalo, the first ambassador to the United Nations from the Free South Africa, who was appointed by President Mandela and served in that role for 10 years.
Dumisani Kumalo's statement. Thank you. I will always remember George Hauser as a gentle but stubborn fighter for justice and peace. I first met George in early 1977 when I just arrived in New York as a political refugee. At that time, I was associated with the Phelps-Stokes Fund, which had given me assistance to live in New York. George asked the late Paul Irish to talk to me about joining the American Committee on Africa as a paid employee. I soon found out that George attracted all kinds of committed people who shared his vision for peace and justice. George did this by creating an environment for activism on anti-racism, anti-apartheid, and anti-colonial struggles through the ACOA and the Africa Fund. George was able to attract the most committed activists, such as the late Annie King, who had met George during his active days as a member of the Congress of Racial Equality. Annie remained a pillar of the ACOA and the Africa Fund family for the rest of her life, and was responsible for the administration and support she gave to the talented activists that George attracted. The freedom struggles of the people of Mozambique through Frelimo received support from George, and so did the people of Namibia through the support that George gave to SWAPO. The same is true of the people of Western Sahara, who George supported through their organization, Polisario. My own South Africa received support from George going back to the mid-1950s, when George Hauser was in contact with the ANC through people such as Walter Sisulu. The first major campaign against apartheid, known as the Defiance Campaign Against Unjust Laws, received great support from George and the Americans he mobilized. George Hauser's genius was that he attracted talented and committed people who then did all the support work on behalf of ACOA and the Africa Fund. People such as Jennifer Davis, who was responsible for most of the research on these campaigns, assisted by Gail Hubby. Paul Irish, who spearheaded the fundraising for these campaigns. Richard Knight, who kept the records of the work we all did, and countless other activists who became part of the ACOA Africa Fund family. Their efforts have yet to be memorialized or even properly recognized. The truth is that many Americans came to know about Nelson Mandela and apartheid through the efforts of George and his comrades. An interesting early memory for me was that when the Zimbabwe Lancaster talks began, it was George Hauser and Paul Irish who bought the suit that Robert Mugabe wore to the London talks. Dumisani served as a model for the suit because, he says, in those days I was the closest size to Mugabe that could be found. George always associated himself with progressive communities that shared his vision and passion for freedom and justice. As a result, his life was well-lived, and his memory can never be wiped away. When I served for 10 years as South Africa's ambassador to the United Nations in New York, it was always a joy to invite George Hauser to diplomatic receptions because he knew many ambassadors and leaders of African countries long before they were members of the United Nations. And let me close by saying that, of course, George knew Dumasani long before he was an ambassador. Last April, I visited Dumasani at his home in South Africa. He spoke with such gratitude for his time with ACOA, and of course he wishes very much that he could be here today and deliver these words himself. Thank you.
Jennifer Davis, as we've heard from others already, was certainly a friend and colleague at ACOA and succeeded, of course, George, who was the first executive director of ACOA in that role after having served as its research director for many years. Jennifer is a South African native and went into exile, as so many did. She came out of the country in 1966. And as we know, ACOA itself, like the Africa Fund, are no longer existing as organizations. The work continues on. I will just share a note for all that there are flyers outside about the African Activist Archive Project, which is one of the ways that the work has continued on. And Jennifer serves as a member of that organization's board, as well as on the board of Shared Interest. And Donna Katzen, the executive director of Shared Interest, is here. Shared Interest works with economically marginalized communities in South Africa, as well as Swaziland and Mozambique. Jennifer Davis, welcome.
Is that okay? Down more. Oh. It's terrible to be so tall. How's that? Those of you who know both Dumasani and me know that he used to tease me constantly because I always had pieces of paper in my hand. I kept all the lists so that we would know what was happening, and it would happen. Now, if I had been keeping the list and chasing Brussels, maybe we would have had it yesterday. But it's hard for me to talk about George, actually, because I tend to start to cry. When I came from South Africa, I was feeling terrible. I didn't want to be in America. I wanted still to be working in South Africa. And George and ACOA provided a base very warmly and very openly in the way that people have talked about the way that he was open to people that he didn't really know, as long as he thought that you were really on the right side. So that for years I worked at the American Committee on Africa. The very first way I worked was typical of George. I went to see him and introduce myself and to ask him if there was something I could do, and he said, well, what could you do? And I said, well, I don't know, I hardly knew the office. And he said, oh, I know, Dennis Brutus is coming, and I don't have a place to stay, and I don't know what he should do. You can do Dennis's program. Well, now, those of you who know Dennis would know that he was South African who got involved very early on in organizing sports boycotts. We have somebody here who could tell us lots more about that. And he went to jail for a long time. The sports boycott was beginning to have impact, and the police particularly really hated him. And so they gave him a very rough time in jail, and they tried to kill him several times, including allowing him to escape and trying to kill him on the streets of Johannesburg. So by the time he came, he was in real bad shape. He wanted to come and talk about South Africa, but he would walk around. Well, now, we did have an apartment, but we didn't have any furniture. I had mattresses on the floor because we had all just arrived. And my kids were, I think, 5 and 6. So they were amazed at this man who walked around talking to himself. But that was typical of George, because it was a perfect match. I mean, I looked after Dennis, and Dennis felt comfortable. He would have felt horrible in a hotel or anything like that. And my kids remember him still. And he sent them a poetry book, not me, he sent them the first poetry book that he wrote. He was a poet as well, after he had finished doing this tour and had begun to settle down in his work. It's a funny example of the kind of coming together